When you play against Alireza Firouzja, there's nowhere to hide. If you think a safety-first approach and playing for a draw right out of the opening is going to save you, you got another thing coming. In our game today, Alireza Firouzja has the black pieces. Jorden Van Foreest has white. This was played at the Super United Rapid and Blitz. 5 minutes for each side with a 2-second increment. Let's jump right in. Again, Foreest has white. He begins with e4. Firouzja has black. He plays d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, and e5. Alireza Firouzja plays the Philidor defense. And here, Jorden Van Foreest decides to exchange in the middle of the board, the exchange variation of the Philidor. Queen takes queen, king takes queen. And here we have a symmetrical pawn structure with queens off of the board. Black has lost the right to castle. White has a little bit of development, but that's about it. And this is seen as a fairly equal endgame, so it's really a question of who the better player is, who's going to outplay who. Bishop c4 was played by Grandmaster Foreest, hitting the f7 pawn that is now undefended, so the king has to move back to keep that f7 pawn protected. Now f4, what white wants to do, says that black's king is stuck in the middle because he can't castle anymore. I want to open up lines of attack. And he would love for Firouzja to just take on f4, and after bishop f4, he's aiming at the c7 pawn. White has a clear advantage. So what Firouzja does is play bishop to d6. He wants to keep the position closed so he has time to maneuver his pieces into a place where he neutralizes his opponent's initiative. Knight f3, knight c6, and here castling. Believe it or not, this is a novelty castling. A preferred move is probably knight to b5, which grabs the two bishops, or threatens to grab the two bishops. After castling, pawn takes pawn was played. Computers like bishop e6, continuing to keep the position closed, and it doesn't really mind the doubled pawns that develop on the e-file after exchanging. That's not really... those pawns control a lot of key squares, as it turns out. But pawn takes pawn. And here, e5. Now, in this position, black can take the pawn. After knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, bishop e5, rook to e1, pins the bishop to the king, but after knight to d7, defending the bishop, bishop to f4, and then f6, the bishop is not going to be captured yet. It's not going to lose any material. The problem is, after rook a to d1, is that for the cost of a pawn, white has a massive lead in development with both rooks on the fully open files, everything developed. So Firouzja doesn't want to allow that to happen after e5. So instead he plays bishop to c5 check, getting out of the fork that the pawn has the bishop and knight under with check. The king obviously has to move. And now knight to h5. This bishop was threatening to grab the f4 pawn. So knight to h5 defends it. As it turns out, slightly better idea, it appears, is knight to g4, threatening to play knight f2 check, and when the king moves over, there would be a discovery from the bishop. But instead, he plays knight to h5, again, defending the pawn, and now knight to d5, threatening knight to c7 check. You'll notice how with this king in the center, white is forcing the king sort of back and forth between c7 and f7, constantly having to defend one pawn or the other. But Firouzja keeps his cool and continues to defend effectively. Here he plays bishop to b6 to defend the c7 pawn. And here, white makes a mistake. It's imperceptible. Looking at this move, it seems like the most natural move on the board. The move he played is knight to f4. It turns out that is an error. The better move is actually to take with the bishop, which we don't want to do because we don't want to lose the bishop pair. But in this case, it's better because of this variation. After knight takes bishop, the pressure on e6 and f7 after knight f3, knight g5 is just too great. So it's actually better to take with the bishop and not the knight. After knight to f4, knight f4, bishop f4, this bishop is sort of blocked. Well, it's not sort of blocked. It's actually blocked by this e5 pawn and doesn't have a lot of mobility. And now bishop to e6. And Alireza Firouzja, this is move 14, has completely neutralized white's initiative. And white has no advantage at all. Alireza has fought back to equality. Bishop takes bishop, pawn takes, rook a to d1, of course, controlling the d1 file. h6, keeping pieces out of the g5 square, particularly the knight, which could attack e6 from g5. h4 gaining space, rook to f8. Alireza hits the bishop at f4, g3 defends it, and now knight to b4. Firouzja is attacking the c2 pawn and the a2 pawn. There is a way to defend both pawns, however. He could play c3. That hits the knight, and now if the knight takes on a2, then simply rook to a1, and the knight is trapped. He would have to play knight to d5, but after bishop c1, it'd be an equal position. But instead, Foreest decides to play c4 and give up the a2 pawn, and Firouzja happily takes the material. After knight d2, knight b4, knight to e4, White's knight is well centralized. The problem is that he can't really do anything with it. All of these potential landing squares are all controlled, and he's down a pawn still, and where is his compensation? Knight to c6, king g2, rook to d8, exchanging off material. c5 hits the bishop just moves to a5, and now h5, taking advantage of this hole. It turns out that White has a tactical shot here. It doesn't completely equalize, but it makes it a very close game. Can you see the tactical move White has in this position that Grandmaster Foreest missed? That's right, bishop takes h6 is actually the best move here. This reveals this threat against the f8 rook, and after rook takes f1, instead of immediately recapturing the rook, White could play bishop to g5 check as an intermezzo, and he would regain the pawn. So that was a chance that he had. Black is still better here because of the pressure against e5, but it would have helped bring the game a little closer to equality. But he plays h5, and now Firouzja plays king to e8. So now that check on g5 is not there anymore. The opportunity has been lost. g4, bishop to b4, building up against c5. g5, pawn takes, knight takes g5, hitting e6 now, king to e7 to defend. The knight comes back to e4. And what I imagine White's trying to do here is to exchange as many pawns as possible. That's sort of a rule in endgames. If you're trying to draw a worse position, you want to exchange as many pawns as you possibly can so that your opponent can't use one of those pawns to queen. King to e8. So now he plays h6, following that principle of exchanging as many pawns as possible, but this move is a blunder because after pawn takes pawn, which was played, the vulnerability of c5 and e5 are too great, and there's no way now that White can defend both of them. He plays knight to f6 first. If he plays bishop to h6, then you could just exchange, then grab the pawn on e5. So he plays knight to f6 check first, after king to d8, then bishop to h6, but then he just moves the rook up to f7. And notice neither one of these pawns is defended now, and he's going to win one or the other. Foreest decides to set up a discovered check on this diagonal, so the king just moves out of the way. The rook goes to h1, trying to create some problems on the back rank, but the bishop can just take the pawn at c5. The knight goes back to e4 to hit that bishop. The bishop moves to b4. Bishop f6, trying to create problems again for Black's king. Rook to f8, just covers that back rank, so there's no problems. Knight to g5 hits e6 again, and rook to e8. Notice, I mean, the toughness of Firouzja in this game is really amazing. He just is, the pressure, he just doesn't make a mistake. He defends everything over and over again, and his opponent is the one that makes the mistakes. King to f3, a5. He begins to march his queenside pawns towards the queening square. King to e4, a4, continuing the push. Rook to c1, knight to a5. Perhaps he can come into b3 at some point. Rook to d1, that allows knight to c4, hitting this b2 pawn. He takes on e6, which he can do. Black cannot recapture the knight because of rook to d8 checkmate. So he can't do anything, but he can take the b2 pawn, which he does. And now this pawn is very, very close to the queening square. Rook to d4 threatens the bishop, but just a3. Just continue ahead. And if rook takes bishop, just a2. And the rook can't stop the pawn because the knight controls the square that it would have to move to. So instead, he plays knight to g7, hitting the rook. And as it turns out, Firouzja could just plow ahead with a2 here and be fine. But he says, why drop a rook when I don't have to? I can move the rook and then advance the pawn. So he just moves the rook out of the way. E6, A2, rook takes bishop, then queening, then rook takes knight. The rook is defended by the bishop at F6, but after queen to F1, threatening that bishop, king moves up to defend it, but then rook to F8. Both the queen and rook attack the bishop. Knight F5, and then queen to E1, check. That forces the king away from the defense of the bishop. The rook would recapture, and Jorden Van Foreest resigned in this position. Tremendous toughness from Firouzja. Very few people could defend for that length of time. You saw his opponent's position slowly fall apart, slowly collapse. A very impressive performance. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.